Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Perpetual here. If you're new, you're warmly welcome. And thank you all so much for joining me today as I make a delicious garden egg stew. Come along and let's get started. And as usual, all the measurements and the ingredients will be in the description box below. Let's get started by chopping up or slicing some onions. And while we're at it, we're going to chop up some tomatoes as well. I like to remove the bulk of my seeds from my tomatoes just because it helps the tomatoes cook a lot faster when I start my stew. And for the star ingredient, our garden eggs, I'm just going to slice it into two after I cut off the tip of it, and I'm going to be boiling that a little bit later. Now, when it comes to selecting garden eggs for your stew, you want to use the ones that are the whitest or the most pale. You do not want to use the yellow ones. The yellow ones are perfect for your soups, but for your stews, again, you want to pick the ones that are lightest in color. So I'm going to get my garden eggs in my pot with a bit of water, and I'm going to cover it up and allow it to cook. Now, your girl here loves her Kobe. Kobe is basically salted fish. So I'm going to cut up a few chunks of it to add to my stew. The flavor that it adds is one that you cannot describe. It's just something that you have to try. And when I cut it up, I'm going to get it into some water to soak for a little bit, and I'm going to keep rinsing and changing the water just to get rid of the excess salt in it. And in addition to my Kobe, I'm going to be using some smoked tuna as well. And for my smoked tuna, I just like to break it up into chunks, different sizes, some smaller than the other. And part of my stew, I will be using egushie, or melon seeds, or whatever you call it. I'm just going to give it a quick rinse, and then I'm going to get it into my grinder with some water, and I'm going to blend it until it is nice and smooth. And you're going to need some salt. You can either add it before you blend, or like I'm doing now, you add a little bit and stir it once you have your nice paste. Next step in my prep, I'm just grinding up some onion and pepper, and of course you can use your blender for this step. And now that the garden eggs are done cooking, once it cools down a little bit, I'm going to remove the bulk of the seeds and add it to my pepper and onions and grind that together. I just don't like to see a lot of seeds in my stew. This step is definitely optional. Now, like I said earlier, you can use a blender for this step, but I just prefer, especially when I'm making a small batch, I prefer to use my Iowa. There's just something so nostalgic and authentic about it. So once I get my mixture to my desired consistency, I'm going to set it aside. And then for my boiled garden eggs, I'm going to chop it up into different sizes. I like some smaller than the other. I just like to have different textures in my stew. Again, just a personal preference, so you can chop it up however it works for you. And now that all the prep is done for the stew, we can finally start. And I actually like to use just regular vegetable oil when I am making garden egg stew this way. So I have a bit of vegetable oil going into my pot, and I am adding my soaked Kobe into it, and we're going to fry it until it is nice and crispy and nice and golden brown. Once we get to our desired doneness, we're going to remove the Kobe from the oil, which has now been flavored beautifully by it. And then we're going to add our onions and allow that to fry for a few minutes as well. And once you get your onions in, you do want to keep a close eye on it just so that it doesn't burn. And since I'm not using palm oil, I am adding about a teaspoon of tomato paste to my stew just to add a little bit of color. Again, the step is optional. I just like that little tint of red in my stew. So after our onions are caramelized, I'm going in with my mixture that I used my Iowa to grind. And I'm gonna give that a few minutes on my stove on medium to low heat. Again, you want to watch it and stir it occasionally. And once the water in the stew reduces, I'm gonna go ahead and add my chopped tomatoes to it. The tomatoes are also going to need a few minutes to cook and the bulk of the water to evaporate from the base of our stew. And then I'm going to go ahead and add our egushie or egusi paste that I made earlier. And I like to make my paste very thick just so that when it goes into the stew, it can curdle up nicely. At this point, you do want to reduce your heat so that the egusi has time to curdle nicely. And of course, if you do not live in Ghana or if you cannot find any egusi or egushie in any of the African stores where you live, or if you do not have access to an African store, you can use eggs in place of the egusi and it will work out just as well. Next up, I am going to add my smoked tuna to my stew and give it a little stir and allow it to continue cooking. And you can cover up your stew to speed up the cooking process a little bit, but you do want to keep a close eye on it as you do not want your stew to burn. And before we continue, if you have not yet subscribed to my channel, please be sure to hit that subscribe button right away and turn on your notification bell as well so that you know when I upload more amazing videos. And after a few minutes, the garden eggs can go in and you can adjust your salt if you need to. And I'm just adding about half of a seasoning cube Any brand works. I am using Maggi just because it is what I have on hand, but any brand of seasoning cube that you have. And I also needed to add a little bit more salt to my stew. And last but not the least, I am going back in with the Kobe that I started my stew with. And I just love the chunks in there, so I put it in last so that the texture holds and it does not break apart or disintegrate right into the stew. And just to allow the extra Kobe-ness to go in there, I'm just covering up the stew for a few minutes on low heat, and I'm gonna give it that final stir and the stew will be good to go. It looks so good. And today we are serving it with some apim, some yam, and of course you gotta garnish it with some hard-boiled eggs and some avocado. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give me a thumbs up, and thank you all so much for coming along with me on this absolutely delicious journey. I will see y'all again very soon.